Hi, Ben. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
My pleasure. I like the background there. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. But before we get to your book, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're all about and why you wrote the book you did.
Sure. The book I wrote is intended, hopefully, to be a launch of a larger brand I call the Chasing History Project. I describe myself as a crazed history teacher adventurer, or a teacher who's finally snapped. And I got the idea to just travel the country, go to controversial events that I knew people would be arguing about what really happened at those events, and try to find out for myself. And I was incredibly blessed by the history gods or whoever's in charge of these things, because in the first year of doing this, I saw a lot of interesting things. I was able to make pretty good guesses. Like, I wrote a book, not published yet, about that time the protesters took over several blocks of Seattle. You know, the news was, if you put on one news channel, it says there's a horrible riot that's burning the city down. You put on another news channel, it says, oh, it's a mostly peaceful protest. And I was like, what really happened? But so I tried to seek that out. That was the first book I wrote. This was during COVID times. And in the middle of editing that book, I saw similar conflicting news reports about MAGA rallies. One set of news channels, which are supposedly reputable and vetted, said there's Nazi flags being waved and white supremacist rallies on the place. And the other set of news channels described it as, I think, the last chance of the Jedi to overcome the Sith, in a battle for pure good against pure evil. So I went to those to check what happened. And in the course of traveling around for different MAGA events, interviewing people, trying to write a book about the general phenomenon, and I was even interviewing people at BLM rallies and a few Biden rallies to try and just write a history book about our time period. One of those days I showed up to interview people, the people in the crowd broke into the Capitol building.
Hmm.
And so when that happened, I was like, well, obviously this is the book. Like, this is what people most want to read about. So I focused on editing and publishing that book first. And that's out now. That's Sorry Guys, We Stormed the Capitol is the title of the book, which is a real quote someone said to me, in which I break down January 6th from beginning to end. But I've also recently launched the Chasing History Project podcast, in which I read chapters of the book out loud and do other things. And other books in the Chasing History Project series have been written but not published yet. So that's pretty much what I'm about. I should mention, you mentioned my backdrop before I forget. This is a picture I took of January 6th, and a lot of those are in the book as well as on my website. They're not professional grade or anything, but my sense is to give you a feeling of what it felt like to be there, rather than just an academic coverage of things. My overall mission of the Chasing History Project is for someone who reads my material to really feel like they understand what it felt like for the event to be going on. People often ask me, like, how did you know that was going to happen? How did you happen to be there? And I was like, I didn't know that would happen. I was already writing a book about this time period in general. I had a van, and I was like a concert groupie following a band around to every event. I just went to as many Trump MAGA rallies on the East Coast as I could manage to get to, because, he was popping in all over the place. And I even fit in other rallies, Biden and BLM, as I was there. But I was mostly interested in interviewing the people at the MAGA rallies. So I had a whole half-finished book that was just based on that narrative of following the MAGA rallies that I thought was interesting by itself. But one of the days where I was already interviewing people, like halfway through, like the title of my book, I overhear someone behind me says, "Yep, sorry guys, we stormed the Capitol." And I was like, "What?" And so the rest of the book came after me chasing after those interviews. But I think I'm able to provide, I think there is some value for the historical record. I really do, because I started interviewing people before anything happened. So I've got this very interesting on the ground documentation of the timeline of events when they showed up that day to when it's going on, and then afterwards, after they'd been dispersed. And it's not just the stuff I witnessed. I interviewed people as they were leaving the building. I got this instant, like, record of what they were thinking, like why they thought this made sense to do, as it was happening, before they had time to think of any excuses or filter it through any of the narratives they were picking up. Just people leave the door, and I did not go in myself. People often ask me that. I decided to stop right at the building. I didn't enter it. But I did interview the people who'd entered it as they were leaving, and I think that's valuable, capturing what they were thinking at that moment. And a lot of the book just turns into straight up interviews. Like much of it will be narratives where I'm describing it, and then I'll just show the transcript of me talking to a guy who says like, yeah, I punched cops inside the building and then they tear gassed us, and I'm like, why did you do that? That's kind of my mission, is to just capture those bits of information.
Hmm. Well, there are certainly other media sources there of all different shapes and sizes.
Yeah.
Were you approached by the police or officials asking, what are you doing?
No, no, the police had other things to worry about at that time. I go back and forth in how much I wish to associate myself with the general press corps. Like there are people, including at this event and at the MAG events, who show up in like bulletproof vests with the word press written on the front of it. I'm like, I don't feel like those guys get the really good interviews. So I just show up in plain clothes. I announce clearly what I'm doing. I ask, hey, I'm an author. I'm writing a book about this. Can I interview you? And, only when they say yes do I turn the recorder on and start the interview. But I wasn't like easily targeted by people as, oh, the press. There's a lot of independent press nowadays, a lot of people doing what I do, right? Books are almost antiquated. It makes me sad because I think of myself primarily as an author, but there's a lot of podcasters, a lot of people like that in any of these events, just making videos for their own purposes. And I don't even make video. I mostly record audio. I take a few pictures. So I didn't attract that much attention. Since you mention it, though, I did speak with some people there who talked about like smashing the cameras for like the official news networks. That was totally a real thing. Personally interviewed a guy who was proud of smashing the cameras for, I think it was CNN. I'd have to check the book, but I didn't encounter any pushback like that. I think they perceived me as either being on their side or being somewhat neutral, which is what I try to present myself as. I try to not be part of any political narrative or team. I try to just call it like I see it. Now, having said that, some of these people calling it like I see it were idiots. Like I'm not in favor of the crowd or anything. Like they broke into the Capitol building. Clearly that's a crime. I mean, if there's someone who can't agree to that baseline level, then I don't know what I can do with that person. But on the other side of the coin, I did feel that a lot of the mainstream news narratives were very misleading.
Hmm. Well, my impression is that the MAGA crowd wants to have exposure. So a person like you showing up, they would want to talk to you once they figure out that you're not against them or even for them, but as you say, neutral. I would imagine they would want to speak with you to get their ideas across.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I think they are a coherent enough group to have that general goal. I mean, like any politically interested group, they usually value a chance to expose their ideas and get them out there.
Yep. Yeah. Now, what did you do at MAGA rallies? They are interesting, and of course, there's YouTube videos where they make fun of they pick the craziest ones and they start talking to them. It's meant to be funny or scary or both. I'm not sure. I don't think that's what you do, right?
No, it's not. What I do, it's harder than it sounds because I think of myself as making the book that will be assigned to bored 17-year-olds to read in history class 30 years from now. Like that's my goal. So I'm trying to reach those high school age people who might be forced to study history and make a book that's actually fun and interesting. And I do think it is historically valuable. I source everything that I didn't personally see, but so I'll add jokes. Like I'll make fun of people. Like I'll like there's like I never use real names when I interview people. I try to never even know them so that I can't be forced to tell them later because people did confess crimes to me in this book, and I would be a very bad journalist if I flipped on my sources. But so like I'll replace their names or make up a name. So like I had a guy who told me that like He ran into the building, got tear gassed, pulled himself together, and then ran back in again. And so in the book, I refer to him as instant replay. And then at the end of the interview, the instant replay said, "Yeah, I don't really know if I'm allowed in here or not," like trying to say that he didn't know he was committing a crime. And I'm like, "No, that's stupid. That's bullshit." Like, I'm going to call bullshit on that guy who's trying to retroactively say, "Oh, I didn't know if it was allowed." So like I do make fun of people sometimes, but I am also my first allegiance is to history, is to getting the truth. And I think that is a little different than some of those other people you mentioned who did somewhat inspire me to do what I do.
Hmm. Hmm. So you were a history teacher before this,
High school history teacher, yeah. It's
and are you? Do you still
very
teach?
at the moment I don't. I took time off during COVID to follow my original dream before being a teacher of being an author. I'd always wanted to write. I was always very inspired by Jack Kerouac and Hunter Thompson, and John Steinbeck's book, Travels with Charlie, is a
Mhm.
very direct inspiration for the Chasing History project, I
Oh, I
think.
like that.
That was Steinbeck's one nonfiction book where he's just driving around the country, interviewing people, trying to understand America and understand the time period because he's gotten old and he feels like he doesn't understand America anymore.
Yeah.
And there's even this chilling sequence where he went to visit, to witness a school desegregation, and there's these little, I forget how young, but like elementary school aged black girls who are being escorted into a public school by the National Guard. And there's these, like, what we now call soccer moms, like these middle-aged white women screaming obscenities at this little kid, trying to make her to turn around and go back. And I read that when I was 16, 17 years old, and I never forgot it. It was so haunting. I felt like, just him standing there and that angry mob bearing witness to it. I felt like I'd read about that before, but he made it real. And that kind of inspired me to go about creating the Chasing History project. I have like a stack of books I've written over the years that never quite got published. I'm one of those guys.
Mm.
And this is the first book I've published, but I'd always wanted to write. I just sort of framed it within my history teacher experiences, and then it was like then it all clicked. Then I was like, "Oh, this is what I want to do."
Hmm. What part of your book covers the phenomenon of people not believing that the election was fair or that it was stolen? Is there any part of your book that covers that?
Oh, tons, tons. I would say the first thing that pops into mind at that question is I noted specifically the speech Trump gave. He made all these references, all these very specific numbers that made it sound like he was very sure the election was stolen. He'd say, like 82,974 dead people voted in Michigan, and he would offer no source, like no explanation for why he believed that number. He'd just say it. But the people in the crowd listening to it, these are the types of people who will go to Washington, D.C. to hear Donald Trump speak when he calls them to. So they trust him. This is the sitting president of the United States. Of course they trust this guy. And so he's throwing out these numbers, making it sound like he's so sure he's caught all of this voter fraud. No sort of backup, no sort of sources. That's extremely irresponsible. Like I would have assumed there was a law against that. Apparently there's not. But like that's so like I don't blame these people that much for believing these things, because this to them this is a trusted source. It's pretty incredible that Trump would do that. I've never heard anyone explain where he got his numbers from, like Twitter or something. So like that's the level of devolvement that it has reached.
Hmm. Well, one can say those things. I believe in your Constitution that's called the freedom of speech, and
Indeed, but
none of these indictments have anything to do with limiting freedom of speech. It's to do with actual actions. So that's how I see it as a Canadian.
absolutely. Well, the Canadians, I I'm not an expert in Canadian law, but I think you've had a few problems with those in the few recent years.
For sure.
But in the United States Supreme Court back, 10, 20 years ago, I thought this was pretty well settled that like there's a few restrictions. You can't shout fire in a crowded room. You can't do things that specifically cause, you know, danger or damage. So I mean I don't want to I value freedom of speech is very valuable. So I
Mhm.
don't want to move the goalpost to catch that.
No.
But it is maybe the problem is that there's no lesser enforcement mechanism anymore. See, like Donald Trump was accused of a lot of things. I'm going to go on a tangent here. You're going to hate me. He was accused of a lot of things that didn't pan out. Like the idea that like he's some sort of Russian asset and we have proof and we're going to impeach him for it, and nothing happened. So now, like, because the credibility of the media and the official story or whatever is so destroyed, having the media call bullshit on Trump on things that they were wrong about. So now to say, oh, he said the election was stolen, but the numbers were all made up. You can't just say that to his followers anymore because they're not going to believe it because the media has lied about Trump about other things.
Yeah.
They'll just think it's just another lie. And so there used to be those sorts of safety mechanisms to call people out for lying in public like that, short of accusing them of a crime, but they don't work anymore because the media cried wolf too many times.
Yeah.
This is what gets me in trouble. Like everyone hates me. Like, the Republicans think I'm a Democrat, the Democrat think I'm a Republican. Everyone says I'm part of the other team that's attacking them, which I think means I'm doing something right. That's
That's
kind of
right.
what I'm going for.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so the media being very antagonistic to Trump and the Democrats just throwing out accusations, Russia, whatever, that they had no proof for, it desensitized people. And so now when Trump really does lie, it's easier for him to get away with it.
I had a thought just the other day that when Trump is done, whether he gets, I mean, he's old and he's eventually going to go away one way or the other.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll become president. I don't know. That's not the point. But what happens to the people who believed all his silly stuff? Like, what are you guys going to do with those people?
That is such a good question, and it's something that I touched on in my book. Actually, it's if you don't mind, this is a section that I have highlighted in my book that I often use in interviews.
Cool.
After everything had really settled, like the police pushed everyone out of the building, like curfew was declared, the streets were empty and dark. I refused to leave. I was still there sitting across from the building, and I found one lone MAGA supporter who did the same thing. And we sat on the curb on his little phone watching live as Congress came back to start their vote again. And he said something to me that touches on your question. Okay. So here we're watching it on his phone. Some senator says something comparing the collapse of the Roman Republic to the American Republic. That's what I always say. I try to listen to what he says, but it's just a rhetorical flourish. He doesn't seem to have any particular point he's trying to make. Do any of them? The guy with the phone and I start discussing the Roman Republic. Trump is Caesar, he says. That's what I keep saying, I gush. I've been saying that for years. He's going to lead us across the Rubicon, he says. I think he already crossed the Rubicon, I say. I think this is him getting assassinated. There is a pause, and then he looks at me. All these politicians, he says slowly and evenly, they don't understand that they're paving the way for somebody so much worse than Trump. This movement isn't going to go away. I've already talked to people who say crazy things like they want to overthrow the government. People hadn't been saying that 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of.
Yeah. Now, I don't know. Predicting the future is so much harder than studying the past. I don't know that I would predict people could realistically overthrow the government, at least not these people. But there do seem to be more people who talk about it. And that's troubling by itself. There could be any number of problems that come from that.
I don't see that
Uh,
happening in the United States. You guys got a very powerful military, and no amount of AR-15s, even if you have the militias combining their efforts, could ever defeat the American military. What do you think?
I tend to agree with that. Like I spent a lot of time interviewing militia guys on this, and for the record, I found them creepy. Like those are often some scary guys. But I think the idea that the privately owned AR-15s could overthrow the government is not going to happen. Having said that, there were a lot of riots in my nation over the last few years. There was a lot of situations that got out of control, that violence broke out. I do think that people who feel this way could cause some damage, especially considering they sort of feed off of the energy from like the Antifa people. Like people try to claim that Antifa doesn't exist or Antifa is like not a group, it's just a belief. That's bullshit. Like when I was in Philadelphia, it took me less than 5 minutes to Google the local chapter of Antifa. They had a website, they had a forum where they planned things. And if there are people who decided to stop using that name, there's clearly people out there who are organized who think violence is just fine, they're justified because the other side is so evil. And the Proud Boys and the militias say pretty much the same thing. Those two forces lead to this escalation. They're constantly attacking each other, escalating each other. They'll show up at each other's events and literally beat each other up. I this was kind of one of the things I was trying to cover and view for myself in the course of this when January 6th happened. um, so that I often equate to the fall of the Roman Republic. There was just two sides fighting each other. And eventually, the official forces, the military, as you said, they could just pick a side and say this side is right and this side is wrong and get involved. If you want to talk about worst case scenarios, that could happen. Now, again, we're going off into. I want to make sure that I'm putting on my speculation hat. Like there's certain things that I'm actually an expert on. Like I can tell you what people said as they were leaving the building on January 6th. Not many people can do that. But there's a lot of other things I end up talking about in interviews, just exchanging opinions that I'm not an expert on. I'm just speculating. And here we're talking about, alternate timelines where worst case scenarios happen. That's what I'm doing here. I'm not officially saying I expect this. The worst case scenario for me is I think there is another election. It's very close. The results are disputed. This is crazy, right? This never happens. And two different people declare themselves winner. Maybe Trump, maybe someone else. And it's close enough in the margins that the, people whose job is just to certify the elections split. And parts of the government start obeying the orders of one winner and parts start obeying the orders of other winners. If you look at other countries that have civil wars and revolutions, that's a reasonable scenario. It has happened in other places, though the worst case scenario would be that it happens here also.
And if it happens, if it happens to the United
Mm-hmm.
States, it's not going to be like a small country like Hungary or Poland or Czechoslovakia back in the Soviet Union days. It affects the entire world.
It does. It does. And like the Great Depression, it started as just a stock crash in the U.S. economy, but when the U.S. economy went down, it caused a worldwide depression back then too.
Yeah.
And the United States is arguably more important now. But at the same time, if our economy collapses, it would motivate other countries to more fully separate their economies from ours. And that does benefit some people, notably Vladimir Putin, perhaps China, but I
Mhm.
think certainly Putin. So again, we're just pure speculation mode. But I have a degree in political science. My whole shtick is that I study the past to help understand the present and predict the future. So I don't feel like I can wave away questions like that. I should always try to make my best guess, but I am guessing. You could make a case that someone like Putin and Russia would like the United States economy to collapse so that they could build up this sort of alternate economy that they've been doing for a while with Brazil and India, the BRICS alliance they call it, and things like that.
Mhm.
So I think those are possibilities. And if the thank goodness we have such competent leaders in the United States who will prevent things like that from
Yeah.
happening.
In chasing history, are you interested, as you progress through your podcasts and your writing of your books, history other than the United States? Like,
Oh,
there's
go ahead.
things happening around the world that are really quite remarkable.
Very much, very much. Honestly, it's really just a question of resources. Like, if I could ever manage to just get paid to do this full time and stop doing all the other hustles I do just to keep the lights on, I was tempted when the Ukraine-Russia war broke out to just go over there and check it out. I feel like that's a historically significant event. I still haven't dropped my prediction that history books may someday view Russia invading Ukraine as the start of World War III. Like they may, I think that's still plausible that they may teach that other conflicts just sort of link up and merge into one larger conflict, as happened in World War II.
Yeah.
I do have a soft spot in me for American history, though. I love the American Revolution. I just inhaled uh, biographies of the founding fathers, the George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, James Madison. Like Madison always gets forgotten. He's so important. He wrote the frickin' Constitution.
Hmm.
He wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that added on to it. And he was the fourth president, but like nobody even knows his name. Um, so I love that time period, and I love also the Roman Republic, which a lot of people don't realize. The guys I just mentioned, they loved the Roman Republic, and they designed our Constitution to deliberately mimic the Roman Republic. So if there's any period of time that Americans should study, if there's any historical period that Americans should know about, it's the Roman Republic,
I agree.
because it's kind of a test case for the system of government we use now. It's very similar.
Yeah.
So for those two reasons, America is kind of my home. I do have sort of a grim destiny I've set for myself, I think. I see myself as my job is to witness the collapse of the United States Republic system of government. I I try to save it as much as I can. I try to do the right thing, but I don't think I'm going to pull it off anymore. Like I had to kind of detach my happiness from the survival of the American Republic. I had to find a way to feel feel I could be a happy person even if I had to live through the death of the American system, because I think I might. I think I might be in one of those Julius Caesar-esque eras of history, and it might be beyond my ability to turn it around.
Hmm.
But I keep trying in case I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So I am kind of an American. I do see these things through an American
Well,
lens.
of course. There's a lot of talk of the southern border. Are you tempted to go down there and try to make sense of that, and you know, for your podcast?
Oh, sure. That'd be very interesting. Like there've been, I think, 5 or 6 major events over the last since I started the Chasing History project that I realized that I thought to myself, if I just had the money,
All right.
like if I could just like pay for food, like I would probably do that. Like one was got very bad in Portland with the size of the homeless tent communities being just massive, like widely underreported in the media. The big strike at the border, the truck driver border between Canada and the United States,
Yeah.
I would have covered that. Uh, the whatever's happening with the immigration situation on the southern border, that was interesting to me. Um, I got out to Philadelphia for the midterm elections. That was my last attempt to cover a book. But see, then nothing happened. Like I'm making educated guesses. I thought maybe because I saw riots almost break out in Philadelphia in when I was writing the book, and I thought maybe they'd break out there at the midterm elections, but they didn't. Uh, and so my preparations came to nothing. And like as it was happening, I saw a few news things in Arizona that said there was like a recount going on there. I was like, oh, that's it. I could write a book about that. There's some interesting event happening there. And I was so close to getting a ticket and flying out there. And then I was trying like, oh, I'm tired. I'm just going home. So I don't always catch history. I chase history. I don't always catch history, but I try.
Hmm. Well, Christian nationalism seems to be talked about quite a bit. People are afraid of it. Some people are pushing for it. Is there something there that may interest you?
I don't think I have any particular experiences that would qualify me as an expert on that subject. The closest I can say is I do think that there is a sort of a religious revivalism happening in America that is just not played up by the media at all. So people who live in regions of the country that where they're not exposed to that, they just have no idea. But like I remember, I think I have a picture of it somewhere when I was just driving up and down the East Coast in a van. I drove past tons of these like homemade signs that someone had just put up by the side of the highway that said like, you will burn in hell. And there were like fires like hand painted on the sign. And it's just like these to me bizarre things. So I do think, first of all, I think times are very hard, also played down by the media. Like they're belatedly getting around to admitting a little, like, after it's been, years of them saying, oh, things are great. You're just, crybabies. But I think there's a lot of people who are legitimately like choosing whether they have money to feed their kids or buy their
Mhm.
kids medicine. And I think when you're backed into a corner like that and no one seems to care, and religion does care, it's not at all surprising there would be a big reawakening in religion. Uh, Whether they pose some sort of threat or not, I couldn't say. I wouldn't immediately say that they are innocent of any possible violence. I'll just add that I think people are violent in general.
Mhm.
Like I meet a lot of people who believe in violence uh, from all sides of the political spectrum, like all these things that aren't supposed to exist. I mean, all these like progressive liberal activists who talk about how loving and tolerant they are, and then they brag about how they beat up a guy and jumped on him to, just for saying something that they disagreed with. There's tons of people like that in either
Yeah.
group, and that is underplayed by
Well,
the media.
there's a lot of stress, a lot of tension.
Hmm.
When I speak to people here, the few times I do talk about politics, I remind them that for at least the last 40 years, I've heard in just talks, with friends and such,
Hmm.
oh, well, politicians, they're all the same. You can't trust them. They promise these things and they don't come true. And I kind of feel that Donald Trump came on the scene and he exploited that. Say I'm not a politician. And that, I think, was the beginning of people believing in things that aren't true.
I was with you till that last sentence there. I think people believed things that aren't true for a pretty long time. I don't know that I think Donald Trump began anything. He did exacerbate things, but I very much agree with what you're saying up to that point. See,
Okay.
this is what the people who hate Donald Trump just refuse to understand. They think that if they can point out some bad thing he did, that all of his supporters will just go back to supporting regular politicians.
Mm.
But this has been building for people's entire lives, and it has been getting worse their entire lives. It reached a breaking point. People it seems so fake to them. Like maybe they don't have, someone like me who has degrees in some of these issues and the time to study it and break down what was provably a lie and what wasn't. But there's a sense, there's a taste that these people are liars. The people on the news, the politicians, they say everything's going great, but there's a bunch of homeless people living in the park where my kids used to play, taking drugs. There's all these violent crimes that I hear about. I know I'm in danger. And these politicians and people on the news, they just want to say that America's great. And the fact that I'm complaining about this makes me a racist. Like, this is not me. This is what people say to me.
Yeah, yeah,
But like, I get that,
yeah.
and like,
Me
so
too.
Donald Trump is not that. Whatever he is, whatever his flaws are, he's clearly outside that system.
Yeah,
All the people I've just described, they hate Trump. And so for a lot of people, that's enough. Just so long as they keep seeing that the people in the news and the mainstream politicians hate Trump, they're like, well, I hate those people so much. If they hate Trump, Trump must be good.
Yeah.
And it's amazed me that all of Trump's enemies have never figured that out. Never figured out that like the more they denounce him, the more popular it is because people hate them. Like people hate what's going on in the mainstream. They demand some sort of change. And, to put a little of my own politics in here for a minute, like the Democratic Party, they hushed up any attempt at change from their side. They bombed Bernie Sanders, just burned him to the ground, made it very clear that he was hated, he was other. So they ran only politicians who were safe, quote unquote, like moderate, normal, not going to make big changes. So the only one talking about change was Trump.
Yeah. Well, that's people want change, but
They
he
do.
offers. I don't hate Donald Trump. I don't hate anybody. He mystifies me. He confuses me when he calls people communists. I get upset at that because my parents escaped communism, and there's no
Mm,
communism in the states. There's not even a left wing in the states, in my opinion.
completely agree. Completely agree. Yeah, there's again, like that's something that I don't think Trump started in any way. This is just like if you turn on like the AM radio, like a conservative talk show host, who I do try to listen to. I try to sample different perspectives so I can hopefully understand my culture. That's my mission, whether I succeed or not. They've been doing that forever, saying, oh, first of all, they use the word socialist and communist interchangeably. So they say that, China is China, they say China is socialist, whereas socialist would in recent years would mostly describe just like countries in Europe where taxpayer dollars pay for the healthcare. But they have this idea that the communists, the socialists, the left wing are all one thing. They're the enemy, and you just blame them. That's just part of their talking points.
Mhm.
I completely agree with you there. That's one of those points where I would actually record myself trying to debate people waiting in line at a Trump rally, trying to make that distinction. Like, come on, do you really like the Democratic Party is corporatist? They're
Absolutely.
controlled by rich and powerful corporations. They're not socialist at all. Bernie Sanders was the only one who even claims the mantle of socialist, and he's actually not a member of the party. He just caucuses with them, and even he is a moderate compared to even European politicians. He's not he's not extreme by any sense of the word.
Mhm.
There is no left wing in America, but so calling people socialist or communist is just that's just scapegoating, boogeymaning. I completely, as much as I sympathize with the MAGA people when they explain the real problems they face, like I just ranted about, I they could not be more wrong blaming the left wing. It's the corporatists that control the Democrats.
Yeah. What do you call fake news?
Well, I mean, I think fake news is when you have a political narrative that you want to get across, and you get that first. And after you've decided what you want your narrative to say, then you cherry pick facts to fit it. That's the most common problem we have in the United States. Although there are a lot of people who just say things that are straight up wrong, and they don't even list retractions anymore. So that's also clearly fake. I think I have a section of my book that I can quote that might be relevant to that. Yeah, so here I'll cut out part of it because it's a little longer than I remembered. But there was a police officer who, what actually happened is he got home from January 6th, told everyone he was fine, slept in his own bed, woke up the next morning, and then the next day he suffered a stroke and died. But there was this concerted effort by the American news media, which was documented by Glenn Greenwald, to insist this police officer was somehow murdered by the crowd on January 6th, which isn't true. There are these two stories that ran through, one that said he got beat over the head with a fire extinguisher, fell into a coma and never woke up. And then when that was disproven, they said, well, maybe he had an allergic reaction to pepper spray, that bear pepper spray. That was disproven. That's fake news. So let me read a little bit where I quoted Glenn Greenwald. As of this writing, more recent reporting is saying the officer may have died of a reaction to bear pepper spray. I'm sure many blue-haired audience members in 2021 will complain I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. After all, he still died. Something bad happened. It was Trump's fault. Who cares about the details? If the people in my time actually read this, they would have long since worked themselves up to a righteous fury and gone off on the internet calling for my head because I was, quote, defending the insurrectionists, end quote. But that's not my point. Accuracy matters. Getting the details right matters. It's the only way we'll ever be able to piece together and make accurate guesses about what pieces we're missing. We'll never have a chance to see the, quote, big picture if the small picture has been embellished to better fit a narrative that someone else has had to push. On top of that, if literally everyone in the media got this wrong, saying the cause of death was being beaten when there was no evidence of blunt force trauma, sourced in the sources on my book, should we really trust them the second time when they come back around and say it was bear spray? Are these credible people? Aside from wearing snappy, well-tailored suits, have they given us any reason to trust them to do even minimal fact-checking? Note, when I was late in the process of editing this book, official reports finally came out admitting he had 2 strokes on the day after the event. They were probably related to the stress of the previous day, but he still died from natural causes. The media tried to push twice the false narrative that the MAGA crowd directly murdered a police officer, and both times they failed to get their facts straight. Again, if you really need me to say this. The crowd is guilty of many crimes. They weren't somehow good just because they were falsely accused of this. But nonetheless, the really catchy narrative of murder that the media doggedly attached to them for months was a lie. The bottom line is this. When your society forces members of Congress to walk past a dead body on display in the Capitol, but nobody bothers to call that guy's family and ask what killed him, it speaks to a deeper issue. It speaks to a culture where narratives are pushed so enthusiastically that accuracy is a distant afterthought. These are not people I trust to leave accurate history lessons for future generations. That's why I decided to do it myself. Does that answer your question about fake news?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right, Ben. Well, it's been a very interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it. Any final words you want to say?
I guess I'll say, first of all, I'm trying to be a good businessman. So all the people listening to this, please check on my website, chasinghistoryproject.com. You can sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, buy the books, all of those good things you can normally do on websites. If you're asking for a final philosophical thought, I could give you sort of a mission statement, I guess, which is I would just, anyone listening to this, anyone who has any reason to, consider anything I'm saying, if there's one thing that would just for the future of our civilization, for my hope that we don't collapse, is stop worshiping political narratives. Stop deciding that you're on the good side and the other people are the bad side and just only filtering for any facts that reinforce that. You've got to use logic. You've got to use the scientific method. We had the Enlightenment for a reason. It was 400 years ago. We shouldn't forget it now. Gather data as neutrally as possible and then analyze it, and only then come to your opinions. Like, I will denounce people as idiots. I will make fun of them. I will make jokes about them, but I gather data first. I always do that, and people have forgotten that because they worship political narratives.
Very good point. Very good. Well, Ben, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. And when you do write any more books, I would love to have you back on the show to discuss those.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Thank you for watching. And before you go, if you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and don't forget to ring that bell for future notifications. You can even leave a comment. All of that really helps in recommending this channel to a larger audience. And if you are an author, I would love to speak with you about your book. Until next time, keep on writing and be kind to one another.